Okay. Last week we discussed verses 11 and 12 from 1 Peter chapter 2. And we noted this first half of chapter 2 deals primarily with the conduct of the brethren towards one another as well as towards those who are outside. And then as we noted there in verse 12, that our conduct is to be honorable among the Gentiles, that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may by your good works which they observe glorify God in the day of visitation. And the term here, verse 12, is beautiful, that which is beautiful, those beautiful works by our obedience to God and the example that we set forth. And then we get into verse 13 and 14, but before we do that, we need to catch up on some questions. Question 5. Give an example of a situation where our beneficial conduct could have an impact on those who see or hear what we do. And of course, the definition of verse 12 of good is that which is beautiful. It's kalos. But it's a benefit. Notice that that's what Peter specifically, which they observe. So what kind of conduct, or what's an example of a situation where my conduct toward God, being what it needs to be, being a benefit to someone else? I know we mentioned one last week. What are at least some of us, I'm sure, going to do here in about 2 hours or so? Go eat. What do we do when we eat? We pray. Yeah. We mentioned that, how that often when people observe that, people see that. And even, obviously we're not trying to make a show of it. We're not necessarily trying to, gain attention by it. But people see right before when we get our food, before we eat, if we're, say a prayer or whatnot. That's one example of an impact that it can have on others. And certainly there are times more at work, sometimes by our actions and by our words, and sometimes by the absence of certain actions or certain words. The way we speak or don't speak can certainly have an impact on others as well. Question 6, is it true as some attest that we are not citizens of this country as we have been set free and are citizens in heaven, and thus we can pick and choose what laws we want to follow?
Jesus would teach, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar, and the things of God, those that are God.
Okay, and there's a distinction between, obviously, all things belong to God, but when it comes to rendering unto Caesar, does Caesar have authority that is separate to God in some way? Or what is Jesus acknowledging when he says that? Especially, of course, in that context, it's about taxes.
The authority of local government?
Yeah, authority of local, and our responsibilities to it. Okay, that we do, just because we have a home in heaven, doesn't take away from the fact that there are responsibilities that we have here on this earth. And so we should be subject to those governing laws, as Paul says in Romans chapter 13, and as Peter here says in chapter 2 and in verse 13 and 14, that we submit ourselves to every ordinance. So no, we don't get to pick and choose what laws we want to follow. But what's an example of some laws that may be included in this argument? There's one that I know that I've had a Christian years ago actually make this argument to me. Well, what's one law that maybe you could pick or choose? We do it every day, most of us. Huh? Speed limit, yeah. Yeah, I had somebody try to argue that the speed limits are really more like guidelines. And so it kind of reminds me of Pirates of the Caribbean. Yeah, they're more like guidelines. So, well, wait a minute. If you're going to get in trouble, if you can be fined for speeding, then it's unlawful. The speed limit, it's not speed suggestion. But they made the argument that no, we're citizens in heaven. The speed limit, we can, if we need to go above it, it's not a big deal. It's just, everybody else does it, so why not us? And that certainly does not apply as far as Christians. We can't just pick and choose what laws we follow and what laws we don't, unless what's extenuating circumstance would be the exception. Conflict with God's law. Yeah, if there's some law that is enacted that by obeying that law would cause us to disobey God, then obviously we have to choose to serve God rather than men. What other examples other than the speed limit might somebody argue? All right. Yeah. Okay. Seatbelt. My grandfather had a really bad habit of not wearing his seat. He didn't like seat belts, and I don't know that anybody likes them. But once the newer vehicle started, doing that ding, 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 ding thing after a little bit, he got to the point where he would put it on. So I can attest that does work in some cases. But yes, the seat belt, and then paying taxes. Okay. Now, obviously, do we work within the system that we have? Do we take advantage of the tax deductions and the things that are given to us or allowed to us to do? Sure. But should we cheat on our taxes? Should we deliberately seek to circumvent giving to Caesar what is Caesar's? And certainly, I mean, people who have claimed to be religious and spiritual have certainly at times chosen to do that. All right. Anything through questions 5 and 6? All right. So as we get to verse 13 and 14, therefore submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether to the king as supreme or to governors as to those who are sent by him, for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of those who do good. It's interesting because a lot of what Peter says is parallel, at least in principle, to what Paul says in Romans chapter 13. Notice, first of all, we submit ourselves to every ordinance of man for whose sake? Why are we doing it for the Lord's sake? What does that mean? It's not just for the king's sake, and it's not for my own sake, it's for the Lord's sake. Why? What did he just get finished talking about? What's one thing that some of these Christians in decades to come and centuries to come will be accused of wrongfully, at least in most cases, wrongfully, and therefore that was the reason for their persecution? Yeah, treason. Treason against the empire, treason against Caesar. They don't follow the laws of Rome and so forth. And that's that evil speaking. They're evildoers. And so what's one aspect of obeying every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake? Yeah. Yeah, it shows that we're in submission. It shows that we're obedient not only to the king or government that exists, but to a certain extent, there's the recognition that in order for me to be submissive to God, I must be submissive to the ordinances of man. And certainly there are people, and I especially in America, because we're kind of raised with this concept, but the idea of being free, certainly there is a certain element of resistance, I think, to authority that may be kind of ingrained in our character as a nation to a certain extent. And we have to be very careful of that. We have to be careful that we don't allow that as society. There's examples throughout society of people being too resistant to authority, where they don't actually obey the laws and they're in favor of what's the word that starts with an A? Without law. Anarchy. Yeah, thank you, anarchy. And obviously, as Christians, we have to be very careful that we don't allow our identity as Americans necessarily to cause us to not be what we should be as Christians, certainly to God and to the ordinances of man. Goes on to say there in verse 13, he says, whether to the king as supreme or to governors, as to those who are sent by him, for the punishment of evildoers and the praise of those who do good. All right. So the king being supreme the example of the governors is the example of, what is Peter doing when he references governors? He starts with king, then he goes to governors. Okay, both the national government, if you will, or federal government, as well as local government. Okay, and those governors that are put in place, they're put there for a reason. Now, all laws of man, at least in principle, are supposed to be there and generally are there for the benefit of a functioning society, which means, generally speaking, the laws that exist, they exist to help perpetuate a lawful civilization, a civilization that lends itself to growth and to prosperity, not to destroying its own people. And certainly throughout the history of man, I've never known of a single example. I mean, obviously there are some. You have dictators and individuals who take advantage of their people. But in terms of successful societies, they have always been in favor of those who do good, and they are always in punishment towards those who do evil. Okay, things like murder, theft, stealing, those types of activities do not lend itself to a functioning society, to a prosperous society. That's why throughout the history of man, not to mention the fact that originated from the law given by God in the garden, or after the garden to Adam and Eve, that understanding of right and wrong as well as what God wants from us, even as it went down into the societies of man and the organizations and governments of man, it was always for the benefit of protecting those who want to do right. Now again, have there been those who have taken advantage of their positions of power and authority? Absolutely. Yeah, history is rife with examples where individuals who were power hungry or greedy or whatever, what have you, they didn't care about their people, and so sometimes they abused those positions. Yeah, but the concept of the government of man, God allows that government to exist for our good. Okay, there's a reason, or one major reason the Dark Ages is called the Dark Ages. It wasn't just because of a lack of education or a lack of furthering of technology. It was also because, I mean, the general, if I remember right, the average age of expectancy was around 29 years old, 30 years old. And the main reason for that wasn't just disease and a lack of basic necessities, but it was also for the fact that there was no law. Okay, many people during the Middle Age or during the Dark Ages, they lived completely day to day in fear of raiding parties and fear of this king taking over this king and just wiping out the people. It was just chaos. And so certainly that's something that's important for us to appreciate. In our country especially, we're extremely blessed, especially when you really look into some of the type of situations that just, our immediate neighbors, like in Canada and in Mexico, the things that some of their people have to deal with that we don't. It's really, truly a stark contrast, and we're incredibly blessed that we live in the country that we do. Anything through verse 13 and 14? All right, verse 15. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men as free, yet not using liberty as a cloak for vice, but as bondservants of God. Honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, and honor the king. All right, so here in verse 15, notice that Peter specifies, he helps define, this is the will of God. This is what he wants you to do. Okay, it's not just, okay, well, I'm a citizen in heaven, therefore I listen to God, I don't have to listen to man. Well, no, God stipulates that in obeying me, I tell you, you have to obey the government that you're in. That by doing good, you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. In the immediate context, what's the doing good? Obeying the law. That is the doing good. And this goes right back to verse 12. Having your conduct honorable among the Gentiles. They're going to accuse you of being evildoers. They're going to accuse you wrongfully of breaking the law, of being against Caesar or whatnot, as they did with Jesus. But the whole point here is you make sure you conduct yourself in a way where there is nothing that they can point to say, see, he actually did break the law. Okay, you conduct yourself in a way that is free from condemnation, according to the fact Peter's even going to get into that, dealing with suffering for the cause of Christ and suffering for doing good. That's a profit to us. That's okay to suffer for doing good. Let it not be said among Christians that you suffer for doing evil, but you suffer for doing good and you're blessed. He goes on to say that by doing good you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. It's very similar to the language of verse 12. Of course, verse 12 is a much broader application. I mean, it's in every aspect of life. But he's narrowing this down here in verse 15, specifically to obeying the laws of man. As free, in what way are we free? I mean, was he speaking to Americans, verse 16? I'm free, you're free. If we were Christians back in Caesar's time, in what way were we saying we're free? I mean, were there some individuals even during this time that were bondservants and slaves? So they weren't free physically. Sorry? Free from sin. But now it's interesting because why would Peter need to make that point? What could you foresee someone arguing that would be contrary to what Peter's saying? Kind of similar to what the case that Paul makes in Romans chapter 6. Shall we continue to sin that grace may abound? In the context of being free from sin, now I can live how I want to. Is that a proper argument? No. Paul says that's not at all how this works. You're free from sin, but that means you've bound yourself under the law of righteousness. You submit yourself to serve that law. Well, in the same way that Christians are saying, there were some brethren making that argument that, well, we're free, now we can live how we want. Some brethren may, and Peter's, it's not necessarily that Peter's condemning anybody necessarily. I think he's maybe heading this off at the pass if anybody hasn't yet made the argument. But he's kind of foreseeing this argument. We've been set free. My citizenship is in heaven. And as Peter himself said, I'm a sojourner and a pilgrim. Therefore, this home is not my home and I don't need to obey Caesar. And Peter wants to make the case, verse 16, yes, you are free. You are free from sin. And to kind of a much broader way, we're free from needing to fear man. No matter what man does to us, we have a home in heaven and it'll be okay, no matter what happens. So even beyond being free from sin, there's a lot of things that we've disconnected ourselves from now that we're Christians. Fear of man is one of them, or should be. But notice what Peter, yet not using liberty as a cloak for vice. What does that mean? And I love the phrase. It's almost poetic in nature, but not using liberty as a cloak for vice. What does that mean? You're free, but don't. You can't use it as an excuse to do what you want to. There's the broad application, and of course within the immediate context, you can't use the idea that you're free as an excuse to do what? Not obey the law. Yeah. Or to speak evil against your rulers and whatnot. Yes, you are free, but you can't just claim freedom and then that means it's okay for me to do whatever I want. And that's exactly what he's saying. Instead, but as bondservants of God. That's what by doing good, you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men as free, not using liberty as a cloak for vice, but rather using liberty as what? What's the contrast? I'm free. He uses the term free. He uses the term liberty. But then he uses a contradictory term at the end of verse 16. What's that? Bondservant. Yes, you're free, yet not using liberty as a cloak for vice, but you use liberty as a bondservant of God. And it goes to show, it reinforces this point. First of all, it reinforces the point that Paul himself makes in Romans 6. Okay, that no matter which one you seek to obey, you're that one's bondservant, you're that one's slave. Whether if it's sin leading to death or of obedience leading to righteousness. It doesn't matter which one you choose. No matter which way you go, you're not free. Okay, you are subject to one or the other. And that concept of freedom, it needs to be defined. It needs to be understood in the minds of Christians. Well, Peter's making that same case broadly as well as specifically in the case of government and of authority. He says, don't use liberty as a cloak for vice. Use liberty in order to do what? Serve God. And what's one way that I serve God in the context? I serve the king, right? I serve the government of man. And by doing that, what's kind of the next step to that? Verse 14. Not only am I submitting to obey man, therefore I'm serving the king and I'm serving the government, the laws. Who else am I serving? Yes, I'm serving God, but we already talked about that. Who else am I serving? Yeah. The people around us, right? The people around us. The praise of those, or verse 15 is when I was mentioned. I said verse 14. Doing good, you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men, having our conduct honorable among the Gentiles, that they may see by your good works, they'll observe it. Okay, not only am I serving God by doing this, by serving the government, by serving the king, by obeying the laws, but I'm serving my fellow man. And it's all a point that Peter makes. Listen, being free can't be defined as doing what you want because it's what you want. No, rather, you're still a bondservant. You're still a slave to God. You've submitted to that role. So, verse 17, honor all people. What does it mean to honor all people? What is honor? What does honor mean? A lot of times our immediate response is respect, right? But I think sometimes our modern definition or modern concept of respect diminishes the concept. What does honor mean? Esteem others. And as Paul would tell the Philippians, to esteem others higher than what? Myself. Okay? The idea of New Testament respect, if you will, the concept of honor, carries with it the idea of exalting others above myself, esteeming others. Honor all. Who is my neighbor? Do I get to pick and choose who my neighbor is? I'm going to choose the neighbors that aren't needy and who don't constantly knock on my door asking for help. Do I get to do that? No. Okay. Everyone is my neighbor, especially from the perspective that Jesus defined it as those on whom mercy needs to be shown. Yes, ma'am.
In my brain, there's also an aspect of submission with honor. I can honor you, but I think about, when you think about honor, of course, the Asian people come to mind, and
Yeah.
they've been their will to those that are old, if they really honor someone. So to me, it's not just holding them in high esteem, but also accommodating maybe their wishes.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
I think you can hold someone in high esteem and
Not honor their wishes.
yeah.
Sure. You mentioned Asian communities who honor is kind of a big part, especially as it pertains to those who are older. My first instinct is to think of Klingons, when I think of honor. And the perspective of that one, though, is the idea that individuals like these, they have a personal code, a personal rule that they go by, and they will not break it. And to them, that's how they define honor. And because this is what their law is, whether it's the law of their government or not, this is their law that they follow. As in our case as Christians, this is the law that God has given us to follow. Man allows a great many things that may not be according to what God wants from us. And as a result, we have a certain aspect of honor to hold ourselves to even when nobody's looking. We must have the integrity of holding fast to that honor. Honor all. You esteem them, you hold fast to that rule, that code, that law that you've been given from God. You esteem others, you put their wishes, not that I'm constantly yielding to everybody, especially if it's something obviously that I shouldn't be doing or they shouldn't be doing. But in the context of my daily life, I should seek to serve others, not seek for them to serve me. In a lot of ways, that esteeming others is a part of that. Anything else through honor? Yes, sir.
In the immediate context, would it also be in opposition to that phrase you talked about in verse 16, using liberty as a cloak for vice? King James would say cloak for maliciousness.
Yeah, yeah.
If I treat others, I can choose to do them bad things, wicked, evil things towards them, and this the opposite of that.
Absolutely.
Esteem.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, because, certainly the concept of maliciousness automatically carries with it, or vice, in this case, vice is a broader term, but the concept carries with it the idea that it's selfishness. Okay, the concept of vice, it really goes down to I do what I want because it's what I want. As opposed, and that carries with it the idea of maliciousness. The things that I do for myself, not for anyone else. It's against others. So yeah, absolutely. That kind of speaks contrary. Honor all. It kind of goes hand in hand with being bondservants of God. Not serving myself and doing ill towards others. Anything else through honoring all? It says, love the brotherhood. This is one of those few occasions where the term brotherhood is used. But what does this Peter mean by the brotherhood? The saints. Yeah. Why doesn't he just say saints? Love the saints. Well, what is he specifically bearing out here that may carry a bit more than just reference to the saints? Yes, ma'am.
Well, there's a familial relationship with brotherhood.
Okay.
I don't know, you just have a different relationship with your siblings than you do other people.
Yeah, absolutely.
And saints is kind of a very generic, not as warm as brotherhood.
Or specific, I guess you could say. Yeah.
Yeah, because we're all adopted by the same father.
Sure.
And so we should try to have the same kind of relationship, or in some cases a stronger relationship with our fellow Christians than we do with our own siblings if they're non-believing siblings. I should
Right.
be closer to the people I worship with than I am non-believing siblings.
Yeah, in this case, water is thicker than blood when it comes to being a Christian, right? And of course, ultimately it's the blood of Christ. That's certainly the point. But this idea of, and it's not that it would be wrong to say love the saints. Obviously, that is mentioned throughout the New Testament, the concept of loving each other and loving the saints. But using this phrase of loving the brotherhood, it carries with it idea of family, as Snoop said, and recognizing that we're in this together. We're doing this together. Is the rest of the brotherhood, or at least should they also be honoring all? And should they also be honoring the king? We're in this together. We do, but are we still pilgrims and sojourners together? Sure. You're not in this alone. You're not by yourself. You have brothers and sisters who are there to help you. Take care of each other. Love one another. Yes, sir. I saw your hand a second ago.
On the one hand, it seems strange that we would have to be given this command to love the brother, to love one another. Remind like Galatians 5, beware lest you bite and devour one another.
Yeah.
I mean, that does take place. And so this instruction, I can even choose, well, my freedom doesn't matter about you around me. I can do what I want even towards those of my family.
Yeah.
Not so.
Yeah. It's interesting, too, that to a certain extent, doesn't this demand contact with the brotherhood? Like, doesn't this demand that I have some sort of connection or communication with the brotherhood? Consistent, right? And that concept of being with them, of having that contact with them, I can say I love, but then what does John tell us about the definition of brotherly love ultimately? Let us not love in word or in tongue, but in deed and in truth. Okay? I have to be able to show that love. So kind of going back to the last couple of weeks, can I do that on my own without having a congregation of God's people to actually associate with? Can I by myself, on my own, in my own little home church with myself, taking the Lord's Supper and doing this and that without the brotherhood? Can I love the brotherhood? No. That kind of just goes to reinforce that idea that it was always intended there to be consistent contact, as we do on each Lord's Day. We have consistent connection. And, yes, ma'am.
I think the other thing with brotherhood is that when we care about somebody, we put them first, right? So if there's, parents get divided when their children have two events at the same time, and it's like, well, I want to do both, but, my husband will go to this one and I'll go to this one, and then we've got both kids covered, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, in this, for me, to love the brotherhood means if it's between a secular thing and something with Christians, I should probably choose the thing with Christians.
Yeah.
Because that's where I'm going to be edified. That's where my priority is. So I'm going to choose that above other things.
Yeah. Which means it's a consistent way of thinking, isn't it? And really, isn't all of this a consistent way of thinking? I mean, doesn't all of this require us to remind ourselves that on the one hand, I'm a sojourner and a pilgrim, but on the other hand, God has commanded me to submit not only to the king, but to those around me as well? I mean, that is a constant reminder. I mean, from day to day, when we're driving, okay, road rage, it is unbelievable just how angry people can get. And people are in their own little world almost. And we have to remind ourselves when we're driving that I'm a Christian and I need to be aware God's watching me, and I need to be aware other people are watching me. They're watching how I drive and what I do while I'm driving. They're aware of that. People see that. They may not know me personally, but they see it.
I think we touched on something also that, going back within this book, the larger context, writing about persecution that's on them and it's going to get worse and worse. As those persecuted would want to divide and make you withdraw and squelch you and so that you're gone. One, you said, I need to stay engaged, the interaction, and those around me, my brother, as they're being persecuted, what more are they going to need than that someone still loves them and shows them concern and goodwill and, helping hand, all the things that go with love.
Yeah. What is one classic tactic that Satan uses that man still, and in a lot of ways it's a sound tactic, it's called divide and conquer, right? When there's safety in numbers is kind of the idea there, but if you can kind of catch the stragglers, catch the sick, I mean, it even happens in nature. You catch those who are lagging behind, that safety in numbers doesn't really apply because they're not really with the pack. And certainly Satan uses that against us if he can. And so, yeah, kind of going to that point, a lot of these brethren who are dealing with persecution, if they allow themselves to kind of lag behind, they could easily get overwhelmed. Yeah, Ben.
When I think about brotherhood, I think about soldiers or sports teams.
It's a special bond.
They face adversity together and they develop a really strong bond.
Yeah.
You know, once that's formed, it's almost unbreakable.
Yeah.
So I think that's unfortunate.
That's a great point. You know, a lot of these, you know, there's been tons of anecdotal situations that have been mentioned and talked about. Some of these fellows who, you know, and ladies who've been over in Iraq and Afghanistan and, you know, other, even going back to World War II, some of these individuals who have been through, they've been in the trenches literally, you know, and they've been through the firefights, and they are lifelong friends after that. And there's like implicit trust between the two or the group. And to a certain extent, you know, even though we're not fighting a physical war, we are fighting a spiritual war. And we are together in the spiritual trenches, so to speak. And that bond should be formed. But it's only going to be formed if we're doing it together. Right? It's not just the formation of a bond in theory. The only way it happens is by actually being in those trenches together. And so that's a great point. That special bond that gets created must be created by being with each other, by having that communication with one another. Because too often, and I really do think this is a major problem for many Christians, too often we feel alone. We feel isolated. We feel by ourselves. And when we get to feeling that way, we maybe get discouraged more easily, more depressed easily. And then all of a sudden, I mean, Satan's just right there. That's where he wants us. And this is certainly one of those aspects of equipping the saints that Peter's writing to deal with persecution, but also to equip us as well. Nolan?
Not to take us backwards in the study.
Sure.
Let's go back a phrase, to honor all.
Yeah.
As he's written the verse above, 12, those who are the Gentiles or the godless.
Yep.
Those who are speaking evil against you, those who may be involved in the very persecution of you, those who speak against you as evildoers. I mean, all these phrases down through this, and then turns around and says, honor all. Which is going to include.
Does that include those persecuting me?
Those also. So another difficult task is,
Yeah.
how do I esteem or hold them up, separate the evil things they're doing
Absolutely.
from the people they are, made in the image of God, as we all are.
Right. Yeah.
He was talking about the parallelism between Peter and Paul in Romans, right? And what does Paul tell us to do to our enemies?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Pray for our enemies, to, you know,
When they're hungry.
feed them when they're hungry. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. You know, and to a certain extent, in a lot of ways, it coincides with how we understand God. He loves all. He hates the deeds that sinful, you know, the sins that people commit. But does he love the people? Yes, he does. And even so, the same, even people trying to hurt us and to do evil to us, we still need to love we can hate what they do, but we still need to love their soul, because Jesus died for them just as much as he died for us. And we have to remind ourselves that that's a very difficult thing to do, especially in the midst of being tortured and in some cases killed because of your faith. I mean, if it were for a just thing, you know, something, I deserve to die. You know, the thief on the cross, what do you tell the other thief? We deserve what we're getting. But for Jesus to be willing to suffer that shame and that torture and have done nothing, in fact, quite the opposite, done nothing to deserve it and done everything to be exalted as king, he still was willing to suffer and to deal with that. Snoop?
I'm just going to say, brotherhood also, to build on Ben's point, indicates shared experiences,
Mm-hmm.
because brothers and sisters have those.
Yeah.
When you take the cruise that they go on, where they're with lots and lots of Christians, shared spiritual experiences, they've
Sure.
had shared physical experiences. I think of Annie and Rick and how much everybody here loves them and they, you know, they feel like family to me because I worked with her parents and her and, you know, so it doesn't matter where they go.
Yeah.
They're always we're gonna love them because they are Christians
Yeah.
and want the best for them. So, I mean, there's things here that people in this congregation have shared that I wasn't a part of.
Yeah.
But I don't love them any differently, you know. And you see it when visitors come here that haven't been, or there's a funeral to go to, you see the grieving of people because they lost a fellow Christian so it's very evident
Yeah.
in this congregation.
You don't just sympathize, but we empathize.
Yeah.
Yeah.
People in this congregation do have a love for the brethren.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, it's interesting because when I was a teenager and I was working with a company that were putting together cubicles in office buildings. It was one of my first jobs. And we had a job in Charlotte that required us to go and stay for, I think it was the week. And towards the weekend, it was Friday after we finished work, I had been to worship that Wednesday to a church there in North Carolina. And there was some members there who invited me to stay through the weekend. And of course, I was like maybe 16, 17 years old. And of course, it was fine with my parents. You know, these are members of the church, and they, in fact, one of them was, I think he was the elder or the preacher. I don't remember which. But I remember my boss and my coworkers were like, "You're going to do what now? And you're sure this is okay with your parents? You don't know these people. Have you ever met these people?" No. But it goes to show, and I remember growing up, there was a fellow, they would travel throughout the country. And every time they'd come back, he would say, "It's amazing how no matter where you go, you have family somewhere. There's family there. And you may be complete strangers in the flesh, but when it comes to those shared experiences, even if it's not physically together, the shared experiences of being a Christian and of having that understanding of the connection between brethren, that carries a tremendous amount of comfort, and it carries a tremendous amount of weight of understanding I'm not in this alone. And it really is unique. It's special. And that's the way God designed it. He designed it for that reason. Any other? I saw somebody's hand, I thought, somewhere. No? Okay. Last part, or second to last part, says, well, let's skip this one. Honor all people. Love the brotherhood. Let's go to honor the king. Honor the king. We'll talk about why we honor the king and what that means not next Sunday. We're going to have a sub. I think he's teaching something different. So 2 weeks from today, since we'll be out of town, 2 weeks from today, we'll pick up here in 1 Peter chapter 2. Also, for everybody, since we're getting close to the end of chapter 2, chapter 3 notes are on the back table. So if you want to pick up the chapter 3 notes with the questions, you're more than welcome to grab those too. Thank you, everybody.